Well, we're in the underground cellars at Penfolds McGill Estate, and I'm joined by Penfolds senior white winemaker Kim Schroeter, who's here to tell us about the 2008 vintage of Penfolds flagship Chardonnay, Yattarna. Pretty good year for the reds, Kim, 2008. How did you shape up with the whites?
Well, it's actually an equally good year for the whites. Actually a really, really good year. Very, very impressed with 2008. The 2008 Reserve Bin was a cracker wine. The 2008 Yattarna is certainly no exception.
Now, tell us a bit about the difference between the Reserve Bin and the Yattarna. How do you stylistically separate these wines?
Well, with Reserve Bin, generally it's a lot of wild ferment. There's much more winemaker manipulation in the wine. With Yattarna, it's much more of a strained, a tight, mineral style of wine, which doesn't have any wild ferment at all. So it's quite a clean ferment and a nice, clean, fruit-driven but intense wine.
Now, the Reserve Bin, of course, is all sourced just from the Adelaide Hills. But
Correct.
Yattarna, I guess you could say the philosophy is a little bit like Grange. We don't mind so much where the fruit comes from as long as it's the very, very best Chardonnay that we can find. And unlike Grange, which is only from South Australia, Yattarna can come from anywhere. So where have you got the fruit from this time?
Well, that's right. But firstly, you're right. The philosophy is very similar to the Reds, multi-regional sourcing, because we want to source from the absolute best Chardonnay regions throughout anywhere in Australia and just get the absolute best fruit we can find. And increasingly, we're finding more and more of that fruit from Tasmania. We've been looking at Tasmania probably over the last 7 to 8 years. And what we're finding is as those vineyards are getting older, we're just getting much, much better fruit every year, so year after year. And no exception with this wine. This is 87% Tasmanian. Whereas 2 years ago, this wine was about 35% Tasmanian, and then it went to about 49% Tasmanian in the 07. Now the 08, 87%, with a little bit of a balance coming from Adelaide Hills.
Well, it's remarkable, isn't it? But I guess when you think about it, Chardonnay as a varietal has really only been commercially grown in Australia in any great volume since the 1970s. And it went through a sort of a renaissance in the 90s and then continued refinement over the last decade or so. So what we're looking at today is quite different from what we might have been drinking 10 or 15 years ago.
Exactly right. It's really an evolving wine, and I guess Chardonnay is an evolving style. You were looking back about 15, 20 years ago, they were quite big and broad wines, and they would fall over in the bottle within 2, maybe 3 years. These wines, we consciously picked that little bit earlier. We sourced from the ultra-cool climates like Tumbarumba, Tasmania, Victoria even. So those ultra-cool climates. So a combination of picking earlier, ultra-cool climate, and just that intensity we get from the outstanding vines in Tasmania. It's produced an absolutely wonderful wine that can last for up to 10 years, maybe even 12 years.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, none will probably last that long in my cellar. I reckon I'll be getting stuck in them early.
Yeah,
but I like
too.
drinking Chardonnays with that youth on their side, when you've got that lovely natural acidity, and that's what stands out for me with this wine. The acidity is just perfectly in balance, and it bodes very, very well for its longevity as well. But if I was going to pair this with something, Kim, food-wise, what would you be thinking?
I'd probably be looking at, because it's elegant yet powerful. So you don't want anything like any light red meat dishes or pork or duck or anything to overpower this wine. So I would generally say seafood is a great combination with this wine, and light chicken dishes as well. But having said that, it can be drunk on its own as well as an aperitif. But I prefer this wine with food, and like you, I prefer this wine drinking in the first probably 4 or 5 years. It will still drink extremely well in 9 or 10 years, but what you will find is the colour will go a little bit more golden, and it will soften out that little bit more and be just that perhaps a little bit more approachable. But I like them young and fresh as well.
Yeah, good. And the oak regime that's used for Yattarna is a bit different from the Reserve Bin as well, a bit more restrained perhaps?
We certainly don't use as much new French oak. It is 100% French oak for 9 months in barrel. It gets 100% barrel fermentation. It gets every 2 to 3 weeks lees stirred in barrel to gain complexity. But unlike Reserve Bin, where they have a higher percentage of new oak, this wine generally hovers around about the 45 to 50% brand new French oak.
Okay.
So the new oak's portion has really cut back.
Yeah, well, in the early days it was often 100%.
Yep,
so
100%, 90%.
It's come right down.
And what we found was that was just way too much. And what it actually does is it masks the fruit. So we want the fruit to really show and what Tasmania and the ultra cool climates can produce. If you have too much oak, you're just going to cover it. So it's in real good balance, like you said.
That's terrific. Well, 2008, certainly a terrific vintage across the board for Penfolds, and just reinforced by what we're looking at here.
Well, I'm really looking forward to this release. It's a great wine.
Kim, thank you very much for your remarks.
Thanks for having me.